My name is Tsehaye Geralyn Hébert. I'm a citizen playwright committed to inclusivity and sustainability. Through my work, I bring communities and different demographics together, sometimes to grieve, sometimes to heal, to celebrate, and to move boldly forward, whatever that means. I'm so excited to be here today with two artists, Lillian Heredia and Terri Lynne Hudson. Both recently participated in 3Arts Body of Work residency program. As a fellow alum from that program myself, I'll be heading a conversation with them about their work, their experiences in the residency, and the ways they situate themselves within the disability culture community. This conversation is part of a series called the Disability Culture Leadership Initiative, led by 3Arts in partnership with Bodies of Work. And special thanks to the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, including Commissioner Rachel Arfa, and the Central West Community Center here in Chicago, which is one of the outposts operated by the Mayor's Office and where we're filming today. Lillian Heredia is a visual artist whose work grapples with past experiences with religion, sustenance, farming, chronic pain, and motherhood through the lens of her background in biology. The second artist joining us today is Terri Lynne Hudson, who's joining us virtually today. Terri Lynne is an actor, a multidisciplinary artist, and disability rights advocate. Her work highlights the generative and inclusive art that emerges when disabled and chronically ill artists are centered and supported. Thank you both for being with us today and for being part of the series. Terri, to get us started, can you tell us in your own words, to describe your art?
Well, I'm a performer. That is the big overall umbrella for me. I perform in a lot of different mediums, in a lot of different ways, but at the beginning and the end, I am always a performer. And I perform because I have a need to tell stories, and I have a need to tell stories that don't usually get told, or stories that don't usually get told through someone who looks like me and moves through the world like me.
I see, I understand. How about you, Lillian?
I make physical objects most of the time. I do a little bit of performance as well, but more like gesture-based performances. But my objects are typically constructed with found material or sort of traditional sculptural materials such as wood or wax or plaster. But I make work about my experiences with a radical Catholicism upbringing in conjunction with sustenance farming, in conjunction with my experience with pain and the medicalization of that. It's sort of like a matrix where all of those things for me overlap, and then I kind of search for ways that those mirror one another.
That's a complex bit of gumbo.
As is everyone's life and experiences.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about what drives your creativity? What gets you up in the morning? What keeps you up at night for both of you? Where do you just go down that path and you're gonna do it until?
Yeah, Terri, you want to lead us out?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. For me, it is a combination of two giant driving forces, and one of those is spite, And the other one that is not spite is that a lot of stuff is happening in my head and I really desperately need to show it to other people. So those are the two things, spite and getting the things out of my head into the world because they have got to go somewhere.
And I might add, with a sense of humor, I'm hearing it, I'm feeling it, I'm sensing it.
I know, I love that spite was reason number one.
Yeah.
Creatively, I'm driven by reinventing a personal like belief system or worldview. I mentioned briefly that I'm coming from this background that's very conservative and very rigid, and I really only broke from that a little bit later in life. And art for me has been like it's been part of that transformation, but it's also been, how do I like create new origin stories and reinvent myself and understand what I believe in and what I'm interested in, and how do I share that with, like, kind of discover it for myself, but then share it with anybody else who's like interested in it, you know?
And as an extension of that question, and I'll get back to you, Terri, with the same question, would you talk about some of the materials that you use, and how does that speak to your need to address being driven and moving in the direction that you're called?
I like to say that I have a lot of things in my studio that aren't art until they're art. The materials that I work with, oftentimes, if they are traditional sculptural materials such as like wax or plaster or even sometimes wood, which I steam bend at times, there is this sort of need for it to go through like a phase change, if that makes sense. Like wax is liquid and then it hardens into like whatever you can sort of coax the form, and plaster is the same. It goes through this reaction and then it becomes what it's going to be based on how you molded it. And steam bending wood is sort of the same thing. So I think it's kind of like an obsession with that phase change, about like transforming something into kind of something else. And then the pull towards the found object it's a little bit like a fascination with biological material. Like, I am genuinely fascinated with anatomy and physiology, not just human, but like animal or like plant. And I think we all have like these universes within us that are endlessly beautiful, and so pulling those materials into my work too just feels like that's already a brush stroke. It's already like doing something lovely as it exists in the world. And so making something natural do something kind of unnatural, like sometimes, interesting thing for me.
Well, Terri, talk with us about what some of the raw materials that you're working with. You talked a little bit about the story and the spite and spices, or I will add as well.
So for me, there's the fact that I grew up nearly isolated and that made me really very strange. And it's an experience that is unique in some ways, but almost archetypal in others. And I refer to a lot of things that I grew up being a voracious reader and also having nearly unlimited screen time. And I could do both of those because I also nearly never slept. So if you put all of those things together and you have this small child who is not independently mobile and who is constantly taking in media and constantly thinking about it and constantly awake, you get this cocktail of someone who is just sort of chewing on all of these images and archetypes and bits of pop culture and quotes and things like that, and stories and reimaginings and retellings of all of these different stories, and thinking, so if I were to tell this story, how would it be different? And if I were to tell this story through the viewpoint of one of these characters that's been with me my whole life, when I didn't have peers I was spending time with, I just had my books and my television, and was often my imagination on these adventures with these fictional characters. What was my perspective of that? And that is kind of what I bring to all of the sorts of storytellings. and bringing characters to life that I do, because I do see acting as storytelling. You know, you're inhabiting this character and this character is inhabiting you, and you are telling their story on your stage or in front of a camera. You're going, hey, this is this person and this is what's happening to them, and that's storytelling. So that is kind of what drives me, is just this cocktail of input in my head that turns into output when I create a story, whether I'm doing traditional storytelling, whether I'm cast in a role and acting, whether I've written something, which I honestly don't even really like doing, and I'm performing it. That's where that all comes from.
Well, I'd like to underscore that both of you talked about reinventing, reimagining. So it totally feels that in your hands there's this real dynamic process that's happening all the time, whether or not it's in the studio, it's in the gallery, or it's here. There just seems to be lots of movement and thinking and shaping of your work. And speaking of that, I'd like to move along with questions about your residency. Could you talk a little bit about your aesthetics? What did you learn? What was shaped for you differently through the time that you had to devote through the residency?
My residency culminated in an exhibition at Access Living here in Chicago. The residency gave me a framework to think about my experience with chronic pain that I had before relegated to sort of this boundary where I don't talk about that, or I'm avoiding that, or eventually that'll go away and I won't have to think about it anymore. And I'm at a point in my life where I can't ignore it anymore. And I spent a lot of time looking back and realizing, oh yes, that piece wasn't just about the sort of the extractive nature of motherhood. It was actually kind of about my contentious relationship with my body, and so more than anything, the residency gave me language around what I was doing, and it also introduced me to ways of thinking about my experience in my body that could be generative instead of dismissive. So the final exhibition, I incorporated some older works that I'd was reimagining for the first time through that lens, through the disability lens. But then I actually generated quite a few new works, and then it kind of felt like a story, felt like I was putting a story together that was that paid homage to what I was doing in the past that I didn't realize it was coming from this place, and then kind of looked forward towards, what else can I make from this place of where my body is at and where it's probably headed.
Well, speaking of that, I wanted to bring the conversation to you, Terri. Your experience is that your relationship with your art forms started earlier. They're rooted differently. And coming into the residency, can you talk about what you learned, what expanded for you?
So I definitely am going to grab that word permission, because I definitely feel like this residency gave me a lot of permission that I didn't feel like I had been able to give myself or get from other institutions in the past. And it was very freeing and very opening. And my project ended up being very ambitious. Like when I applied, I was like, well, I'm an actor and there's a pandemic, and, I am medically vulnerable / chronically ill. So I'm not out doing plays anymore. So I don't know what I'm going to do if I get this. I guess I just have to write a one-person show and do the one-person show, because that's what one would expect if I'm doing theater. But when I met with my mentor, I really felt like I got this permission to go, no, you can kind of do whatever you want to do. Like, this is your time, this is your space. Just do something. And so I kind of tried to do all the things in 2.5 months. And it was very ambitious. Thankfully, I have technical support at home from my spouse, who is an engineer, because I was like, well, I don't want to be anywhere in person. And I'm going to draw a hard boundary line there, but we have the technology, so we're going to stream something. And with that, I also, when I was told about having collaborators, I immediately reached out to other disabled artists who I've known in my life with some other overlapping marginalized identities who don't live here. And I was working with someone from Texas, and I was working with someone in Sweden, and I was working with someone who I thought was here and ended up being in a different state altogether. And we all got to create things together, and I made this show as sort of a collage of all of those things. And I also felt free to work in media that I wasn't necessarily that familiar with, but was interested in, but had always felt like I was put in this box, like, no, this is not what you're good at. You need to stick with the thing that you're good at. And I was like, well, if I tried, maybe I could be good at this, or maybe I'm better at this than I think I am. So my work actually ended up having visual art in it, and it ended up having original music in it, and it ended up having all of these different components, because I really got this feeling of, why not? Why can't I? I don't feel like I'm hearing that I can't or that I shouldn't, so I'm going to, and here it is.
Oh, absolutely. I would have to concur. That's kind of what it felt like for me as well.
For me, like a big aha moment, which I kind of just realized as you were speaking, was that typically my process, I'm doing a lot of research, I'm doing a lot of reading, I'm like kind of taking in a lot of things, and then I produce something and I kind of understand why I made it. And in this residency, it was like a reverse engineer kind of process. It was like, oh, that's why I made that. Or it was like kind of impossible for me to think that anybody had considered those things in the same way that I had, just because it had been so inaccessible to me. And so there was a reverse engineering kind of to my typical process.
When I look at your work, I also saw different forms and, the expressions. Each piece looks very different, but I understand the collection. So I wanted just to speak a little bit more about form. And then, Terri, I want to come back and ask you the same thing about how is work formed for you. I understand it's theater, and I'm also hearing that there's something else that's being born as well. So form-wise, how do you choose? Does the form choose you?
I think sometimes the form comes out of the raw material or the found object that I'm working with. Like, I want to just duplicate that. For example, maybe you're referring, like, there's a piece that I made with a mold that I made from communion wafers, and it was really important to me that look the same as a communion wafer does. But then there are others that seem to reference like a microscopic inner tissue or an inner like organ, but then they're outrageously magnified in real space. So I think sometimes it comes from the found object, and then other times I'm thinking a little bit about like zooming in and zooming out, and my experience with chronic pain and this condition that I'm constantly revisiting in my life, that there's a little bit of like the inside coming out, and how that manifests in the studio, how the experience of chronic pain, it kind of dismantles predictability in terms of like scale or duration. And during the residency, I really tried to lean into that.
Terri, talk about the forms that your work is now taking, if you will, and what does that mean for you?
Right now, my work is going in a lot of very interesting directions. One thing that happened with me during the beginning of the pandemic as I was transitioning to remote work, and then when remote theater dried up, I started getting into audio narration. So an awful lot of what I do right now is narrating other people's stories, but I'm bringing myself as the storyteller to all of those stories. And so storytelling was very much in my mind when I started working on my 3 arts work. And so I created this character who was going to be telling some stories. And I wanted to work within things that either I had written or that were sort of in the public domain. So I started looking at traditional folk and fairy tales, which are things that I've always been really fascinated with, especially as you grow up and you find out that we've been fed a lot of, sanitized stories that started out a lot darker. And I like exploring that darkness. I like dark. I'm a big horror junkie. So everything is like, what is the horror movie retelling of this like? And that's just kind of how I roll through the world. So I made this character who was sort of a princess in a tower, and the princess was choosing to be in this tower because outside the tower is the plague. And everything that happened within the world of my performance was either the princess journaling, reading stories from her journal, or dreaming. And in her dreams, she explores the outside world because in her dreams it's safe-ish, because in fairy tale land, things aren't always safe and you never know when they're going to get unsafe. And so I brought some of that stuff that had been cooking in my head since I was honestly a small child into the world, and that was my material.
Well, we're going to continue on. We have a few more questions, and but we did want to ask a bit about some of the challenges that you're also facing. What does it mean to be a member of this community?
I'm embarking on a new career because I've been living without health insurance for a few years, which is unacceptable and unsustainable. So I would say challenging wise is that graduating from art school and somehow carving out an existence that it, at the end of the day, like I still was struggling to pay my mortgage, and I still didn't have, there's just like financial stability kind of stuff is challenging. And then I think explicitly making work from the place of acknowledging, either like a limitation or an experience that is like generally not pleasant for me. There's a little bit of like, that's kind of a weighty, heavy thing, and making work from that place is not always like buoyant and joyful. Like it's kind of necessary, but I think it's something that requires a little bit more time on the backside to process and work through that, which I make work about a lot of heavy stuff. So, they all sort of take their toll, but I think it would probably be those two things, is like the very practical things that that our world just does not make space for creative practitioners, and that in and of itself is very difficult. And then making work about things that are hard to talk about and hard to process.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Terri, what are some of the challenges that you are facing right now with your work?
I mean, well, we have the fact that, I am a chronically ill, medically vulnerable actor during a pandemic, that people are in denial about being a pandemic. And so there's not a lot of work for me out in the world. And there's constantly negotiating with people who approach me wanting to do things. And I'm like, okay, what are your COVID precautions? And if you don't have any, I can't work with you. Is there a way I can participate remotely? Can we make a way I can participate remotely? And it's really interesting seeing where, people have all of these boundaries about how they can do live performance and who has to be physically in the space and who doesn't, and why not. I understand that some of that is complicated when you get into the unions and, the fact that we have had AI and people's images stolen, and so they've got a sort of blocker on, using virtual stuff and recorded stuff because they are worried about it being used against them, and they've been facing rules about that. But there's also the fact that, as a mobility impaired stage actor primarily, there were only about, I'd say a quarter to a third of the stages in Chicago are all that I ever had access to before the pandemic. And the fact that there's so few spaces where disabled actors can work, and that we don't have the same access to opportunities and don't have the same ways to climb the ladders, and there's another access joke there, that non-disabled actors have access to. And I'm like, somebody needs to do something about that. And we now have all of these tools where we can bring people into spaces that are not necessarily accessible. So why are you telling me we can't even do that? It sounds to me like you're committed to ableism and we're trying to get you to be committed to access. So with my performance, a thing that I was also trying to say was, and I'm doing all of this from my living room, and why can't we have more of this? Like, how do we make space for maybe someone's voice to be in a space that their body can't be in? Or to have, okay, some people physically in the space, but can someone be pre-recorded? Can somebody be streamed in? Can we explore those things instead of just going back to normal because normal was fine when no, normal was not fine for an awful lot of people?
That actually leads me, if I may,
Sure.
leads me into the question that I was sort of formulating for Terri, is that I find it so interesting that that is your medium, given that, I don't know a ton about theater, but I am a theater lover, and I don't see those spaces, like a lot of spaces are not accessible, but like I see those being like excessively so, especially if you're, even as an audience member, but especially as a performer. And I'm curious, like, if you didn't really have any choice, like that was the thing and you just had to do it, or is this part of the spite thing where you were like, you say I can't be there, I'm gonna be there, like that's what I choose because it's that way. That being like part A of my question, and then maybe I should ask part B afterwards, but I'm also curious. Okay, I'm gonna go do part B. And then part B is like, when you are taking on a role and you're telling a story, do you feel like you are embodying like who you are as a disabled artist even more so, or do you feel like you're temporarily like transported out of it? Those are two very different questions, but those are the things I'm curious about.
With wanting to be an actor, I started wanting to be an actor when I was about 8 years old, and I don't think that I understood the physical rigor. Because, when you go to see a play, you're often just, the lights are out, the spotlight's on the stage, and there's people sitting at a table or standing there, maybe doing a little bit of walking back and forth, and you don't see the whole precarious backstage, and you don't see the 3 flights of stairs up to the rehearsal room, and you don't see all of that. And whereas I was encouraged to watch a lot of theater as a kid, I didn't get to perform until I was an adult. Like, I just wasn't indulged in that way. And I don't know if it's because the adults in my life feared accessibility, or honestly, if they just thought it was silly and a waste of time and I should focus on other things, because I was very much pushed towards like hard academia growing up. But so, yeah, a lot of it was ignorance more than spite at that point. I just saw the thing and wanted to do the thing and did not realize everything that the thing entailed until I was up here and 18, 19 years old and going to auditions and being like, oh, this is up 3 flights of stairs. Well, I've got to make a decision right now as to whether or not I'm going to go up these flights of stairs and commit to going up these flights of stairs for the next 8 to 12 weeks. And I spent a lot of my early career honestly harming my body trying to pretend I wasn't disabled to people, because I also thought I wouldn't get hired if people realized I was disabled. I didn't know there was like a disability performance community until way later. I wish I'd found it earlier.
We do have another question or so, and then I think we're about wrapping it up.
I would really like to ask my question. So I'm really interested in the fact that you came into art later after doing a more, sensible, practical career that like I probably would have been aimed at initially, and I just kind of refused. And I'm kind of wondering, like, what was the spark? What did that for you? Why art then? Why art now?
Yeah. I think I always had that within me, but I ignored it and I denied it because it wasn't practical and it was not supported. And I had nobody in my life that was mirroring that, like showing me how to do that. So I it's interesting. I go around and I meet people and I realize that I'm coming from we're all coming from really unique backgrounds, but the journey from there to here necessitated a total breakdown of beliefs, family structures, I'm also like really into true crime, but I'm also really into learning about cults, because I wouldn't call what I came from a cult, but like pretty close. So it really meant burning everything down and then making everything from scratch, and art being like the only thing that made sense. And I don't know, I talked a little bit about origin stories. It was like I'm trying to reinvent personhood and reinvent a belief system and a worldview, and that's not easy, but it's getting easier. And especially with opportunities like this, where I'm constantly, it's been happening since the get-go, but I'm constantly being introduced to like a new community that I felt I had no knowledge of, or I was afraid of, or and the veil being lifted and like, oh, this is also available to me. So that's the reason for later in life, and I wish I'd done it a lot sooner, but at least I did it. And
You're here now.
yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. I think that we're wrapping up, but let me say that what an honor it is to speak with both of you. What an incredible time it is for us as artists, period, in that for us to be able to not only make art, but to be able to talk about art with each other. Sometimes we're in the making, and to be able to have some reflection and to really savor what it means for us at this time is pretty remarkable. And I thank you both for your art. Thanks for bringing some compelling ideas to the table, both of you. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you, both of you.